In Cutter's Ford, Colorado Territory, in the autumn of 1887, the congregation of the First Presbyterian Church gathered every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock with the reliable industry of people who believed that appearances, faithfully maintained, constituted a kind of virtue. They filled the pews in order of standing. The banker, Reginald Crail, in the third row on the left, with his wife and daughters arranged beside him like a set of matching china. The mill owners and the feed merchants in the rows behind. The working families at the back, and the women who took in laundry near the side door. The preacher, a man named Garwood, was known for sermons that ran long and for a particular attention to the sins of pride and ingratitude, which he seemed to find most prevalent among those who could least afford to defend themselves. Nora Voss had sat in the fourth pew from the front every Sunday for 26 years. Then, on a cold morning in November, she did not come. She never came again. What she had found inside the vault at the bottom of the Ember Saloon was not in itself remarkable to look at. 3 leather ledgers, a tin deed box, and a bundle of deposit receipts tied with butcher's string. The vault itself was an Otto and Brenner floor model, Class 4, fabricated in St. Louis around 1872, with a dual lever mechanism that her father had described to her in precise detail the winter before he died. She had known, the moment the auctioneer's hammer fell, that she was the only bidder in the room who understood what she had bought. The question is not why she left that congregation. The question is what was written in those ledgers and whose names were recorded there, and how long those names had been hidden beneath a floor that the congregation of Cutter's Ford had been walking over every Saturday night without knowing what they trod upon. If you have ever wondered whether the truth can outlast the men who buried it, stay with this story. Nora Voss believed it could. She spent 31 days proving it. The Ember Saloon had been closed for 11 years when it came to auction in October of 1887. The building stood on the south end of Cutter's Ford's main commercial block, a 2-story affair of Douglas fir planks gone gray with weather. Its sign faded to the ghost of letters that only certain angles of morning light could still read. Delinquent property taxes had accumulated in the county recorder's office since 1876. The previous owner, a man named Corbett Dawes, had died without heirs in the spring of that year, and the estate had passed to his creditors, who had argued over it for a decade, until the county finally moved to foreclose and sell. Nobody in Cutter's Ford wanted the building. It was considered unlucky, which was the word the town used for things it did not want to examine directly. She attended the auction with $37 and a leather satchel containing a single tool her father had made. She was 28 years old, of slight build, with dark brown hair pinned in a low bun at the nape of her neck. She had been working as a bookkeeper for a hardware concern on the north side of town for 4 years, since the death of her father had left her the apartment above his locksmithing shop, and a trade she had been learning since she was 11. She had sold the shop itself the previous spring to cover debts she had not known her father carried. The apartment she still held, but barely. The auctioneer was a man named Pickett, and he had the professional disinterest of a man who had sold off enough failed enterprises to find the proceedings unremarkable. He read the legal description of the property in a voice that suggested he expected no one to care. The Ember Saloon, Lot 14, Block 7, Cutter's Ford Township, Jefferson County, Colorado Territory. Delinquent taxes of $112 to be assumed by the purchaser. Starting bid of $40. There was a silence. One of the mill owners in the back shifted his weight. Reginald Crail, who had come to watch rather than bid, folded his arms. Nora said, $37 and the assumption of taxes. Pickett looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. The silence in the room changed its character. Several of the men present exchanged glances of the kind that require no words. Then Pickett shrugged in the manner of a man who has his fee regardless, noted the figure in his ledger, and asked if anyone would better it. No one did. She walked out of the auction room with a deed in her satchel and a debt of $112 to Jefferson County. Someone behind her, she did not turn to see who, said that she had bought herself a very expensive piece of firewood. She had heard that kind of thing before. Her father, Jonas Vass, had come to Colorado Territory from Vienna by way of Cincinnati, carrying a set of locksmith's tools he had inherited from his own father, and a knowledge of mechanism that most frontier tradesmen considered overqualified for the territory's needs. He had built a modest business in Cutter's Ford, specializing in the safes and strongboxes that the mining operations and merchant banks required, and he had taught Nora the trade the way he had learned it, by feel, by patience, and by the understanding that every lock was a conversation between the maker and the person who needed access, and that reading it required both technical knowledge and a quality of attention most people had been educated out of by the time they were grown. He had described the Otto and Brenner floor vault to her specifically in the winter of 1883, because a client had brought him a salvage purchase from a Denver estate sale and asked him to assess its mechanism. The Class 4 model, her father had said, was manufactured with a dual-lever lock of a type that Otto and Brenner had patented in 1870 and quietly discontinued by 1875, after the design was shown to have a vulnerability in the secondary lever's engagement point. The vulnerability was not catastrophic, and the vault was not easily defeated, but it meant that a person who knew the specific geometry of the secondary lever's tolerance could open the lock without the combination, given the right tool and sufficient time. He had made her a tool for that specific geometry, not because he had plans to use it improperly, but because he was a craftsman who believed in understanding the complete range of what a mechanism could do. The tool was a flat carbon steel pick, 7 inches long, with a curved tip ground to an angle that no standard set included. He called it a compensator. She had carried it in her satchel in a fold of chamois cloth for 4 years without occasion to use it. She had an occasion now. She spent the first 3 days simply moving through the building, cataloging its condition. The ground floor was a single large room, the bar itself with its shelving empty but intact, a scatter of overturned chairs, a floor of pine boards silvered with dust. The kitchen at the back was sound. The second floor held 4 rooms that had served as lodging, each containing a bed frame and nothing else. The stairs were solid. The roof had been repaired clumsily at some point in the last decade, a section of fresh shingle over old, and it had held. She walked the floor with a lantern held low, the way her father had shown her to inspect a space whose history was unknown to her. Not looking for what was visible, but listening for what the structure told underfoot. A floor speaks when you learn its language, telling you of rot-softened boards, the hollow return of a cavity below, the slight spring of a joist not fully seated. She moved in parallel tracks, east to west, then north to south, making notes in a small book about what she observed. The bar counter was solid walnut, scarred and stained but structurally sound. The mirror behind it was gone, leaving an oblong of lighter-colored plank where it had hung. 3 of the chairs were repairable. The rest were not. A single pair of elk antlers still hung on the north wall, coated in a decade's worth of dust, the tines casting thin shadows in the lantern light. She opened every door and every window that would open. She pressed her hand against the exterior walls to feel where moisture had penetrated and where it had not. She climbed to the roof by way of the exterior ladder at the building's rear and walked its surface carefully, noting the repair work and the condition of the surrounding shingles, and she came down satisfied that it would hold another winter without attention. She was assessing precisely what she owned and what she owed, and by the second evening she had a fair accounting of both. On the morning of the fourth day, she found the vault. She had known it would be there. Corbett Dawes had been a man who kept cash, according to the two people in Cutter's Ford, old enough to remember his operation. A woman named Flossie Marsh had worked at the Ember briefly in 1874, and a retired freighter named Del Grube, who had delivered supplies to the building for 3 years before Dawes closed it. Both of them had described Dawes as a careful man with money, the kind who did not trust banks, which in Jefferson County in the 1870s was a judgment that most thoughtful people shared. Grubb had seen once a floor panel behind the bar counter lifted and replaced in a way that suggested something beneath it that Dawes did not want observed. The panel was still there, under 30 years of grime and the accumulated drift of sawdust and ash. She found it by the sound it made, a slight hollow return when she crossed it, different from the boards to either side. She lifted it with a pry bar and found the vault set flush into the subflooring, its door facing upward, its combination dial gone to oxide. An Otto and Brenner, Class 4, exactly as she had guessed. It bore the date stamp of 1872 on its backplate. She did not rush. She spent 2 days cleaning the mechanism's exterior, working rust from the dial, housing with a fine wire brush and oil, not because the dial mattered, but because the secondary lever's engagement point, buried inside the lock body, would need the surrounding metal to move freely before she could read it. She worked in the mornings when the light through the saloon's east-facing windows came in at an angle that caught the tool in her hand and turned the vault's face visible. She ate her midday meal sitting on the plank floor with her back against the bar, a heel of bread and a slice of dried apple, listening to the town outside move through its ordinary business. She had been carrying the compensator pick long enough that its weight in her palm was entirely familiar, the way the handle of any tool becomes an extension of the hand after sufficient use. Her father had made it from a piece of clock spring steel he had saved from a repair job in 1879, drawing it out on his bench until it reached the 7-inch length and the particular taper he had wanted, then tempering it 3 times to get the spring he required, and hand-grinding the curved tip to the exact angle the Otto and Brenner's secondary lever demanded. He had spent the better part of 2 evenings on the tip alone, measuring the angle with a set of machinist's gauges and correcting it twice before he was satisfied. When she had asked him why he was being so precise about a tool he had no current use for, he had said that an instrument made for a specific purpose should be made correctly or not made at all. That was the kind of statement her father had made regularly, which she had accepted as a child and had come over the years to understand as the operating principle beneath everything he had taught her. She felt the mechanism's condition through the pick's tip the way a physician feels a pulse, attending to the quality of the contact rather than forcing an outcome. The primary lever had corroded slightly in its track and required several sessions of patient oiling before it moved with any freedom. The secondary lever, which the Otto and Brenner's design placed at an oblique angle to the primary, was stiffer. She worked it in small increments, applying force and releasing it, reading what the steel reported back. On the 3rd morning of working the mechanism, she felt the secondary lever move. It was a small thing, a 1/4 inch of travel against the tool's curved tip, a change in resistance that most people would not have recognized as anything significant. She had been trained to feel it. She stopped breathing for 3 seconds, the way her father had taught her, and held the pick perfectly still, and then she applied the precise counterforce that the Otto and Brenner's geometry required at that moment, and the lock gave. The vault door opened on a breath of air that had been sealed inside since sometime in 1876. The interior was 16 inches deep and 24 wide. She saw the 3 ledgers first, their spines unmarked, bound in dark green calfskin, of the kind that merchants used for account books. Beneath them, a tin deed box with a hasp lock, the kind that opened with a standard key and had not been engaged. Beneath the deed box, the bundle of receipts tied with butcher's string. She did not touch anything for a full minute. Then she lifted the first ledger out with both hands, carried it to the bar counter where the morning light was best, and opened it. She understood within the first 4 pages that she was reading something Corbett Dawes had not intended to survive him. The ledger was a record of loans, but not the ordinary kind. It documented in a cramped and careful hand a series of transactions going back to 1869, in which Dawes had operated as an intermediary between a group of Jefferson County landowners and a Denver investment firm called the Continental Land Improvement Company. The landowners had put their deeds up as collateral against operating loans. The Continental firm had accepted them, and then between 1871 and 1874, the loan terms had been quietly altered in ways the landowners almost certainly had not been informed of, and the deeds had transferred. 18 properties in all. The total acreage came to 4,260 acres of Jefferson County land, most of it in the valley east of Cutter's Ford, where the good soil lay. The entries were in 3 different inks, which told her the ledger had been compiled over time rather than transcribed at once from rough notes. The earliest entries, in a faded blue-black that had the quality of an iron gall formulation, dated from 1869 and were written in a smaller, more hurried hand that she took to be Dawes at the beginning of the operation, when the scheme was still being organized and the entries had not yet settled into a form. The middle entries, running from 1870 through early 1873, were in a darker ink and a more deliberate script, the hand of a man who had decided what he was doing and was keeping his record carefully. The final entries, in a brown-toned ink that looked as if it had been stored improperly or mixed too thin, dated from late 1873 and carried a changed quality in the handwriting itself, something tighter and more compressed, as though the man writing them understood that he was recording a conclusion rather than a middle. She read those last entries twice. They described the final 6 transfers in terms that were, even in Dawes's careful language, notably bare of the framing phrases the earlier entries had used. Where the earlier transactions had been described as loans secured by collateral, these final 6 were described simply as transfers, with the dollar amounts and the acreage and the names of the parties. There were no terms. The frame had been dropped. Whatever Dawes had told himself about the nature of the arrangement in 1869, by late 1873, he was recording it as what it was. The second ledger recorded what happened to the money. She was not a lawyer. She was a locksmith and a bookkeeper, and she understood numbers the way her father had understood mechanisms, as things with an internal logic that could not be falsified, only obscured. The numbers in the second ledger told her that the Continental Land Improvement Company had never actually deployed capital. It had received deed transfers and paid out a fraction of their assessed value in loans, then collected the land when the altered terms went unmet. The firm's operating address in Denver was a law office. The principals of the firm were recorded in the second ledger's inside cover in Dawes's handwriting, and 3 of the names on that list were still living in Cutter's Ford. One of them was Reginald Crail, who sat in the 3rd pew of the First Presbyterian Church every Sunday. She sat with the ledgers for the remainder of the morning. Outside, the street was ordinary. A wagon passed. Someone's dog barked twice and stopped. The town conducted its business in ignorance of what lay on the bar counter, as it had done for 11 years. Have you ever held in your hands a document that explained something everyone around you had accepted as simply the way things were? Stay with this story. She spent the next 4 days reading the deed box. It contained the original transfer documents, notarized in Denver, bearing the signatures of the landowners alongside signatures she could now identify as either forged or obtained, under conditions that the ledger's loan records made highly suggestive. 3 of the documents bore dates that did not match the ledger's internal sequence. One contained an addendum in handwriting different from both the body and the signature, adding a penalty clause in terms no working farmer would have agreed to knowingly. She made notes in a composition book in her own hand. She did not number the pages. She did not sign her name to them. She worked methodically and without haste, because she had learned from her father that the value of careful documentation was its irrefutability, and that the way to make something irrefutable was to derive it twice, from different directions, and see that the conclusions met. They met. She wrote to a land attorney in Denver on the 8th day, giving only her address and not her name, describing what she had found in general terms and asking what the territorial statutes of limitation were for fraudulent land transfer in Jefferson County. The attorney's reply came within 10 days. It was 3 sentences and a citation. It confirmed what she had already suspected, that the fraud, if provable, fell within a class of civil wrong that the territorial court recognized as having no limitation period, where the underlying title remained in the hands of the original defrauding party or its successors. The Continental Land Improvement Company had dissolved in 1878. Its assets, including the 4,000 acres of Jefferson County land, had transferred to a successor entity called the Jefferson Valley Agricultural Trust. That trust was still active. Its registered agent in Jefferson County was Reginald Crail. She made 2 copies of every relevant page in all 3 ledgers. She did this with a pen and the careful hand of a person who had spent 4 years keeping books, working by lantern light in the evenings after her daytime work was done. It took 11 nights. She numbered the pages of each copy in a separate sequence from the originals, and she keyed her copies to a summary index she wrote on the inside cover of her composition book, so that any person who received the copies would be able to match each page to its position in the original. She was making the record as navigable as she could for people who had not held the originals and who would need to reconstruct the story from the copies alone. The originals remained in the vault, which she locked each night with a bar brace of her own fabrication, bolted through the subflooring in such a way that it could not be pried from above without a noise that would carry through the building's walls. She had made the bar brace from iron stock at a smithy on the south end of town, giving the smith measurements and a drawing without explaining what the brace was for, which the smith had accepted without question, in the manner of a tradesman who knows that customers frequently have reasons for what they order. The copies went into 2 separate envelopes, one held at the apartment under her mattress, one given without explanation to Delgrub, who received it without asking questions and put it under his floorboards, with the equanimity of a man who had seen enough of Cutter's Ford to find this unremarkable. She took the 3rd ledger to an attorney in Colorado Springs, not Denver. Denver was too close to the people who would want to know about what she carried. Colorado Springs had a territorial circuit court office and a land records examiner named Whitmore, who had a reputation passed to her by the Denver attorney's brief follow-up letter for thoroughness. Whitmore was a spare man of 50 or so with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead, in the permanent attitude of someone interrupted mid-task. He received her in his office on a Thursday morning in late November, and asked no questions about how she had come to possess what she placed on his desk. He read for approximately 20 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. "Where are the originals?" he said. "Safe," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the way that people who do not expect precision sometimes look when they receive it. "You understand what you have here," he said. It was not a question. "I need to understand what can be done with it," she said. He had a quality she had not entirely expected and which she appreciated. He did not treat her instruction in the law as an indulgence. He spoke to her as he would have spoken to a colleague, using the correct terminology, and then pausing to define it when the definition mattered, without apology for either the complexity or the clarification. She had brought her composition book, and she wrote in it throughout, in her bookkeeper's shorthand, and at the end of the 2 hours she had 4 pages of notes that translated the relevant statutes and procedural requirements into terms she could work from. He told her. It took 2 hours. The territorial court had jurisdiction. The fraudulent transfers, if documented as thoroughly as the ledger suggested, constituted grounds for a civil nullification proceeding against the Jefferson Valley Agricultural Trust. The original landowners or their heirs would need to be identified and notified. A title examination would need to be conducted against the trust's current holdings. And the evidentiary standard for nullification under territorial statute required both documentary proof and at least one living witness who could authenticate the original transactions. She had 3 pages of the first ledger that contained, in Doss's handwriting, the names of witnesses to the original loan closings. 2 of those names she found when she returned to Cutter's Ford and asked careful questions belonged to men who had died. The third belonged to a woman named Cecilia Harp, now 71 years old, who lived in a cabin 4 miles south of town and had not come into Cutter's Ford for any reason she could name in the last 5 years. She walked 4 miles in November mud to knock on Cecilia Harp's door. The road south of town ran along the base of the ridge before it descended into the lower valley, and in November it was not entirely a road so much as a record of where wagons had passed when the ground was soft enough to take an impression. She wore her heavier boots and carried her satchel and walked at a pace that kept her warm without tiring her, the way her father had always walked when he was going to do work at the other end. The sky was low and white. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone bare. 4 miles was not a long distance in good conditions, and these were reasonable conditions, and she arrived at the cabin in the middle of the morning without having thought much about the distance at all. The cabin sat in a slight depression below the road, with a kitchen garden wrapped for winter in straw and burlap, and a pen with 2 goats who regarded her arrival with the philosophical indifference of animals that have made their peace with their circumstances. Smoke came from the chimney. The door was solid. The old woman answered after a long pause that suggested she was deciding whether to answer at all. She was short and broad-shouldered, with the hands of someone who had spent decades doing outdoor work, and she looked at Nora with the cautious assessment of a person who had been disappointed enough times by arrivals to have made a policy of reservation. Nora introduced herself. She said she was the new owner of the Ember Saloon. The old woman's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to name precisely. Something closed and something else came open in nearly the same instant. "You'd best come in then," Cecilia Harp said. They sat at the woman's kitchen table for 3 hours. Cecilia Harp had been 19 years old in 1869, working as a domestic for one of the Valley families whose deed appeared in the first ledger. She had been present at the original loan closing because the family she worked for had asked her to witness their signature, it being a common practice for household employees. She had not known at the time what she witnessed. She had come to understand it only gradually as the years passed, and the families she knew lost their land in ways that did not accord with what she had seen them agree to. She had said nothing for 18 years because she had nothing to say it to, and because the men whose names were at the center of it were the men whose decisions governed every element of daily life in Cutter's Ford. And she was a woman alone who was owed nothing by the county's legal machinery and knew it. She was willing to speak now. The territorial court proceeding was filed in December of 1887, 4 weeks after Nora walked out of Cecilia Harp's cabin with a signed affidavit in her satchel. The filing was made by a Colorado Springs attorney named Aldrich, who had been retained on a contingency arrangement, and it named the Jefferson Valley Agricultural Trust as defendant and identified 18 properties whose original transfer documents were alleged to be fraudulent. Reginald Crail was named individually in his capacity as registered agent. The filing cited the Continental Land Improvement Company's records, the Ember Saloon vault ledgers, and the testimony of Cecilia Harp. The copy of the filing that arrived at the offices of the Cutter's Ford Courier was published on the front page of the paper the following Thursday. Under the headline, "The editor chose because it was accurate, and because he was a man who had always found Reginald Crail's manner of occupying the third pew excessive." Crail did not appear in church that Sunday. He did not appear in his bank office the following week. His attorney, a Denver firm, filed a response to the territorial court proceeding that contested the admissibility of the vault documents and questioned the authenticity of certain signatures in the deed box. The territorial court appointed a documents examiner from Denver to assess the authenticity question. The examiner, who had no relationship with any party in Jefferson County and whose fee was paid by the court, rendered a report in February of 1888 that found all but 2 of the challenged documents consistent with the claimed period, authorship, and circumstances of execution. The 2 inconsistencies the report identified were the addendum in the different hand and the date discrepancy, which the examiner noted were consistent with post-execution alteration rather than wholesale fabrication. The proceeding moved through the territorial court over the course of 8 months. Nora continued to live in her apartment above the former locksmith shop. She continued her work as a bookkeeper. She opened the Ember Saloon building to a woman named Garrett who wanted space for a laundry operation, charging her a monthly rent that covered the property taxes and left a small remainder. She did not speak publicly about the proceeding except when asked directly, and then she answered in terms that were accurate and short. Some people in town came to understand what she had done and said so to her face, which she received without particular emphasis, as she received most things said to her face. Others found the proceeding alarming in ways they could not cleanly articulate, which was the effect that the exposure of long-standing arrangements always had on the people adjacent to them, who had not participated but who had benefited in the diffuse and unacknowledged way that communities benefit when certain questions are simply not asked. Cecilia Harp came into Cutter's Ford for the first time in 5 years to give her deposition. She wore a dress that had been good once and a hat that still was. She walked into the county recorder's office with the composed bearing of a person who has waited a long time for a door to open and is not going to hurry through it now that it has. After the deposition, Nora met her outside, and they walked together to the Ember building, and Nora showed her the vault, open, its contents laid out on the bar counter in the afternoon light. The old woman stood and looked at it for a long time, without speaking. "He kept everything," she finally said. "He did," Nora said. "I always wondered if anyone would find it." Nora did not answer that directly because there was nothing direct to answer. The vault had sat in the floor of a building that stood in the middle of a town for 11 years, and no one had looked because no one had known what looking required. She set the vault's door back and the Otto and Brenner mechanism engaged with its usual clean click. There was, in that sound, nothing dramatic. The territorial court issued its judgment in September of 1888. Of the 18 original properties, 12 had sufficient evidentiary record, both documentary and testimonial, to support nullification of the original transfer. The Continental Land Improvement Company's successor deeds to those 12 parcels were declared void. The Jefferson Valley Agricultural Trust, as the current holding entity, was ordered to reconvey the title to the heirs of the original landowners, subject to a survey to account for any improvements made since 1876. Damages were assessed against the trust for the rental value of the properties during the period of unlawful holding, though the court acknowledged that full recovery was unlikely given the trust's financial circumstances following the proceeding. Reginald Crail resigned as registered agent of the trust before the judgment was issued. He and his family left Cutter's Ford sometime in the spring of 1888, before the snow cleared the Rampart Range, for a destination that the Courier noted with a brevity that expressed, in journalistic form, the collective willingness of the town to let the matter conclude. The 6 properties that the court could not restore were ones where the chain of heirs had become unrecoverable, or where the documentary record had gaps the examiner's report could not bridge. Whitmore had told her in Colorado Springs that this would likely be the case for some portion. She had filed the case with the evidence she had, not the evidence that would have been ideal, and the court had done with it what courts could do. It was not everything. It was substantially more than nothing, and substantially more than had existed before. A woman with $37 and a 7-inch carbon steel pick had stood in an auction room and made an offer that struck the assembled men as a kind of joke. 12 families received notice of reconveyance through the winter of 1888 and the spring of 1889. Most of them were heirs, not the original landowners. The original generation had largely died. A woman named Ruth Selman, 44 years old, received notice that 160 acres of valley bottomland that her father had lost when she was 9 years old was hers by operation of law. She came to Cutter's Ford from her home in Pueblo to sign the reconveyance documents at the recorder's office. Nora was not present at that signing. She had not been asked to be there, and she had not arranged to be. The transaction belonged to Ruth Selman and the court and the recorder, not to the person who had found the records that made it possible. But Whitmore had written to her when the reconveyances were complete, a letter of 3 short paragraphs, formal in tone and precise in language, that said in the last sentence that in 30 years of practice he had not seen a civil proceeding more carefully prepared or more honestly pursued. She read it once, folded it, and placed it in the same tin box where she kept her father's compensator pick. Neither the letter nor the pick required further handling. They were simply the record of work that had been done. The first Sunday, she did not attend church. 2 women she had known since girlhood stopped her on the street afterward to ask if she was unwell. She said she was perfectly well, thank you. The second Sunday, no one asked. The congregation of the First Presbyterian Church reorganized itself around her absence the way congregations reorganize around most absences, closing the gap and continuing without remark. If some of them understood why she was not there, they did not say so publicly, and she did not explain herself. The reasons were various and hers, and she did not owe them to anyone. Cecilia Harp, whom she visited 4 miles south of town once a month through the winter of 1888, had her own view of it. "When you've read what you read in those ledgers," the old woman said one afternoon, "and then you look at whose name is on the deed box and whose name is in the 3rd pew, it becomes difficult to sit in the 4th. Nora thought about this and said that was part of it. What's the rest? She considered for a moment. The kitchen was warm and smelled of pine resin and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Outside, the snow had reduced the visible world to 100 yards of white field and the dark line of the tree break beyond. "My father taught me that a lock keeps nothing secret from the person who knows how to read it," she said. "He meant it as a statement about mechanisms. I have come to think it applies more broadly." Cecilia Harp said nothing for a moment. Then she reached across the table and poured more coffee into Nora's cup, which was the kind of agreement that does not require additional words. The Ember Building continued as a laundry through the winter and into the following year, and the year after that. The vault remained in the floor, latched but not locked. its shelves empty and clean. The compensator pick returned to Nora's satchel, to the fold of chamois cloth her father had cut for it. The ledgers were held by the territorial court as exhibits in the proceeding, and after the judgment was final, they were transferred to the county recorder's archives, where they remained cataloged under the Jefferson Valley Agricultural Trust case number, available to anyone who knew to ask for them. She was not wealthy. She did not become wealthy. The building generated a modest income, and the bookkeeping work was steady. And she lived in the apartment above the former shop and worked with the precision and patience her father had given her. The town did not celebrate what she had done exactly. Towns rarely celebrate the exposure of their own arrangements, but it acknowledged what it could, in the sideways manner of acknowledgement that frontier communities managed, which was something, and which was as much as she had expected. The vault was what it was, a mechanism Class 4 by Otto and Brenner of St. Louis, opened by a woman who had been taught by her father how to read what was sealed inside. What it held had been there all along, waiting for the right hand and the necessary attention. "These are not exceptional qualities," her father had said once, when she asked him how he had learned to do what he did. "They are only rarer than they should be." The compensator pick sat in its chamois fold in her satchel, worn smooth at the tip from the one use it had been made for. She carried it still. She did not expect to need it again, but she had been taught by a careful man who believed in keeping your tools close and your understanding of what they could do complete. That was the whole of the inheritance, and it had been enough. Have you ever known someone who held on to what she was taught until the moment it was needed? Leave a word for Nora in the comments below. And if this kind of story is the kind you return to, there is another one waiting just ahead. This story is a historical dramatization inspired by the land fraud patterns common to Colorado territory in the late 19th century. The characters, institutions, and specific events depicted are fictional,